The junkyard. Don Felipe was the night watchman at a junkyard for crashed cars on the side of the highway, just outside a small Mexican town. He had been working there for over 10 years, watching over the vehicles that arrived after accidents. Some with barely a scratch, others completely wrecked. He had always been a practical man with no time or patience to believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, until one night everything changed. It was during a rainy early morning when the bus arrived. Don Felipe was in the guard booth, sipping coffee to stay awake, when he heard the sirens and the rumble of the tow truck approaching. Stepping outside, he saw the red and blue lights reflected on the wet asphalt and knew something serious had happened. The bus had been involved in a fatal accident on the highway. A drunk driver had veered out of his lane and struck the passenger bus, causing it to overturn and tumble down a small ravine. News reports said there were several dead and many injured. Don Felipe watched as they unloaded the bus at the junkyard, a twisted mass of metal and shattered glass. Blood still stained some of the seats and the vehicle's floor. From the moment the bus was placed in the yard, something changed. Don Felipe felt it, though he couldn't explain it. The air grew colder and an unsettling silence fell over the place. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to the shock of seeing such a damaged vehicle and knowing so many lives had been lost in it. That same night, the events began. It started with small noises, almost imperceptible at first. A creak here, a thud there. Don Felipe thought it was just the typical sounds of cooling metal or the wind against the structures. But soon, the noises became clearer and more distinct. Footsteps as if someone were walking among the cars. He peered out the window of his booth but never saw anyone. The following night, the noises were accompanied by whispers, voices he couldn't understand but which filled the air with a sense of dread. He walked through the yard with his flashlight, calling out to the supposed intruder, but always found himself alone. The whispers followed him, sometimes murmuring in his ear, other times laughing softly. He couldn't sleep, and when he finally managed to close his eyes, he had nightmares of being trapped inside the bus, surrounded by shadowy figures with eyeless faces staring at him. But the worst was yet to come. One night, during his usual rounds, he heard a scream. It was a sharp, desperate scream that froze him in place. It came from the bus. With his heart pounding and his hands trembling, he approached. The bus was there in the dim light just as it had been left. The seats were destroyed, and the broken windows glinted in the beam of his flashlight. Suddenly he saw something moving inside, a shadow crawling between the seats as if searching for something. Don Felipe backed away, but before he could move further, the shadow turned toward him. It had no face, just a dark, shapeless blur. And then the scream came again. This time it filled his entire mind, a cacophony of voices and cries that brought him to his knees. He tried to escape, to run back to his booth, but something held him back. It felt like an invisible force was pinning him down, dragging him to the ground. He stayed there, unable to move, watching as the shadow stretched out from the bus and crept toward him. He felt cold, invisible hands crawling over his skin, gripping his legs and arms. Finally, after what felt like hours, the shadows vanished. He managed to stand and stumble back to his booth. Trembling and drenched in sweat, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He didn't know if it had been a dream or real, but the following nights were no better. Every time he closed his eyes to rest, the shadows returned. He woke up with his body aching as if he'd been beaten. Sometimes he couldn't move, watching as the shadows loomed over him, whispering incomprehensible things. Each night, the screams and whispers filled the junkyard until he felt like he was going mad. Don Felipe began to fear the night. He thought about quitting, about leaving, but he couldn't. He had nowhere else to go, and no one believed him when he tried to explain what was happening. So he endured, hoping that somehow it would stop. But every time he looked at the bus, he knew something was wrong. The souls of those who had died in that crash hadn't found peace. They were trapped in that mangled piece of metal. Finally, after weeks of torment, the day came when they came for the bus. It had been sold for scrap metal, and that morning, a tow truck arrived to take it away. Don Felipe watched from the booth as they hooked it up and loaded it onto the trailer. A sense of relief washed over him as he saw it being taken away, like a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. That night, for the first time in a long while, the junkyard was quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no screams. Don Felipe sat in the booth, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The air was calm and the junkyard felt at last like an ordinary place. He was able to sleep without nightmares. He didn't feel the cold, invisible hands that had tormented him. The next morning he woke up feeling like it was all over. The bus and whatever it had brought with it was gone, along with the shadows and the screams. He avoided telling this story, saying no one would believe him. People say that the souls of the dead sometimes cling to this world, trapped in the places where they met their end. Don Felipe had no doubt that's what had happened. The souls of those who died in that bus couldn't move on until the vehicle was destroyed, until there was nothing left for them to cling to. And so, he carried on with his life, working at the junkyard, guarding the wrecked cars, hoping he'd never again see anything like that cursed bus. The Nawal of the Ranch. This story I'm about to tell was narrated to me by my grandfather Mateo. I will try to recount it just as he told it to me. He worked on a ranch in the 1940s, a vast property far from the city, surrounded by hills and dense forests. The ranch was known for its extensive lands and livestock, which made it a prosperous and enviable place. However, it also became the setting for something many preferred to forget, something that left a dark mark on everyone who was there at the time. It all began with the disappearance of some animals from the corral. At first, we didn't give it much importance, thinking it was probably the work of some predator from the wild, like a coyote. But then, the disappearances became more frequent. We found no traces of struggle, no blood, no footprints that could tell us what kind of animal was taking the chickens, pigs, and even young horses. My companions and I were worried, suspecting that cattle rustlers might be nearby. We knew the animals disappeared during the night, but we couldn't figure out who or what was behind it. For that reason, we were tasked with night watches, taking turns guarding the corral and the surrounding area. We armed ourselves with what we had, some rifles and pistols. We were determined to end whatever was stealing from us. The first time we saw it was on a moonless night. We were sitting around a campfire trying to stay awake when we heard a noise in the corral. It was a soft sound like something sliding through the shadows. We stood up with our weapons and approached cautiously. That's when we saw it. It wasn't an ordinary animal. It was a dark figure, larger than any coyote we'd ever seen. It moved with an unsettling agility, almost as if it were floating above the ground. It had a humanoid shape, but at the same time it wasn't. Its eyes glowed in the darkness with a red shine that made us step back in terror. One of the men fired, but the bullet didn't seem to affect it. The creature turned towards us and made a sound that wasn't a growl or a screech. It was something in between, something that chilled us to the bone. In that moment we fired all at once, but nothing seemed to harm it. That creature simply vanished into the darkness, as if it had never been there. Those of us who saw it couldn't sleep all night. We knew what we had seen wasn't an ordinary animal, it was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. In the following days, fear gripped the ranch. The animals continued to disappear, and the presence of that thing felt closer every day, as if it were mocking us. Some of the men began to talk about witchcraft and Nawals. They said that creature was a man who could transform into an animal, moving between the world of the living and the dead. At first, I didn't want to believe it. It seemed like a ridiculous superstition. But after what we had seen, I couldn't rule anything out. We tried to catch it again, setting up ambushes and waiting for it to return to the corral, but it always managed to escape, as if it knew exactly what we were planning. That's when someone suggested the idea of seeking a person to bless the bullets. They said ordinary bullets couldn't hurt the Nawal, but if a healer blessed them, they'd have the power to harm it. We didn't have many options, so we sought out a healer in a nearby village. He was an elderly man. We explained what had happened and asked for his help. The man nodded slowly, as if he already knew what was happening. The bullets must be blessed. Only then will they touch the Nawal's flesh, he said. He gave us the bullets after a night of preparation and warned us about the following night. We readied ourselves for the final ambush. We hid in the darkness, waiting for the Nawal to appear. The tension in the air was palpable, and fear weighed heavily on our chests. We knew we couldn't fail. This was our only chance to end that thing. Hours passed and finally we saw it. The creature moved with the same unsettling agility, approaching the corral. We prepared with the blessed bullets loaded in our rifles. We waited for the right moment, and when it was close enough, we fired. This time, the bullet struck its body, and the creature let out a piercing scream, a sound that still haunts me at night. The thing fell to the ground, writhing in shifting forms. For a few seconds, we saw its body fluctuate between human and beast, as if it were struggling to maintain its true form. Finally, it fell silent. We approached cautiously, weapons still raised, but it no longer moved. The Nawal's body disintegrated into the darkness, leaving only a trace of dust on the ground. We stood there, trembling and sweating, unable to believe we had finally defeated it. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to spread in the nearby village. They said a man from a neighboring community had been found dead in his home under strange circumstances. He had no visible wounds, but his body appeared completely dehydrated, as if all life had been drained from him. People started whispering that the man was the Nawal we had killed. I never knew if the rumors were true, if it really was a man who transformed into a beast. The only thing I know is that after that night the animal stopped disappearing, and the ranch finally returned to normal. Since then I've learned to respect the stories of Nawals and witchcraft. There are things in this world we can't explain, beings that hide in the shadows and perhaps only reveal themselves when they feel threatened. The stepmother's witchcraft. Based on an anonymous experience, my mother Brenda rarely talks about her childhood, especially the years she spent living with her stepmother. However, sometimes, when the silence of the night grows too deep and her memory betrays her, fragments of what happened when she was 15 slip out. What she told me the last time left me frozen with fear and convinced that there are things in this world beyond what we can see and understand. It all started when my grandfather remarried a woman named Julia. My grandfather had been widowed when my mother was just a child, and after years of loneliness he met Julia. At first she seemed like a kind and loving woman, but everything changed when she brought her own daughter Letitia into the house. Letitia was slightly older than my mother. Julia had high hopes for Letitia, planning for her to marry well and live a comfortable life, but she saw my mother Brenda as a threat to those plans. Brenda was young, beautiful, and despite her youth, had a presence that drew attention and admiration. Julia began to see her as an obstacle, someone who might overshadow her own daughter. At first it was just little things. Julia made life difficult for my mother, giving her the worst chores, scolding her for insignificant reasons, and constantly criticizing her in front of others. But that wasn't enough for Julia. She wanted to get rid of Brenda, ensuring that Letitia had an unchallenged future. That's when strange things began happening. My mother started getting sick for no apparent reason. She had fevers, headaches, and nightmares that left her exhausted every morning. Sometimes she said she felt a weight on her chest, as if someone was sitting on her while she slept. Other nights, she would wake up with marks on her skin,